This presentation is on CVSS and what's going on in that space. And we want to talk this morning about becoming CNAs, having P-certs in your organization and all that. One of the things that, if you haven't done that already, that's going to be important is you need to be familiar with CVSS. So I thought I'd do this today, kind of bring everybody up to speed. Most of you probably have heard of it. You've used CVSS scores, but it's probably unusual that if you've actually done any scoring yourself, unless you're a P-cert member that's actually creating CVEs, you probably haven't. So anyway, let's talk about that. So first, obviously, always, what is it? Then talk about the basics around scoring vulnerabilities. And then the most important thing is the CVSS SIG is releasing the end of this month, the 31st, Halloween, an exciting time, is planning to release anyway, version 4.0. A lot of folks are still using 3.0, and there's been a 3.1 for quite a while, but it's going to be releasing 4.0. So I'm talking today about what's in 4.0 and how's it different and that kind of thing. And I'm actually going to demo a scoring process, which probably most of you have never seen. And then we're going to talk about some calls to action. Okay, what is CVSS? It's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and they created a new logo there for this version, for version 4. See with the little flutter bar there, I thought it was fairly clever. There was we saw the secure boot with the lock on it earlier. They did the same kind of experiment with CVSS and tried to get it to create a logo, and didn't have a lot of luck with that. So somebody proposed this, it actually worked. Anyway, the National Infrastructure Advisory Council launched version 1 of CVSS in February of 2005. In April of that year, it was handed control over to FIRST, which was mentioned earlier, the Forum on Incident Response and Security Teams, which, by the way, the UEFI Forum is a member of as part of the UEFI Security Response Team, which I lead. It's been very quiet for us lately. Everybody's discovered reporting things, as was mentioned earlier when Tim started reporting things where they can get more bang for the buck than telling us about them. But the USRT, Security Response Team for the UEFI organization, has two jobs really. Is when somebody reports something that's actually due to a design flaw in the specification, it's our responsibility to try and figure that out and get it to the right team to get the specification fixed. If it's a fundamental flaw in the specification that's going to cause everybody to be vulnerable, we need to get that dealt with immediately in the organization so everybody can fix it. The other thing is, a lot of these security researchers have no idea who to contact in this complex supply chain that we've been talking about. So we've kind of acted as a front person to say, we'll take it. If you don't know who to talk to, if you've got some kind of vulnerability you've discovered or you think you do, whatever it is, if you can't find anybody else to talk to, come to us, the security response team, and we'll figure it out and get it to the right person. And what we found in many cases between the OEMs and the firmware vendors and that kind of thing, that if there is a true vulnerability and somebody, if it's broken, it's probably broken in a bunch of places. And we found that if a developer makes an error creating a vulnerability, that developers at other companies probably make the same stupid mistake. It may be not in the exact same line of code, but once we discover, so we have a distribution list, a notify list, where we can just say, hey, a vulnerability's been found, it looks like this. You might want to check your code base to see if you see anything like it, and we found quite a few that way, where people people have just recognized, oh, they made that mistake. Oh, let me see. Oh, looks like we did too, but a slightly different place in the code, but yep, we made the same stupid error. Sorry, not stupid, but it happens. Anyway, continuing on here. The various versions of CVSS have come out over the years, and a lot of us are still using 3.0, which came out in June of 2015. 3.1 is the most widely used at this point. That's 2019, and we're about to come out with the latest version in 2023 on Halloween. Who uses it? It's been adopted as the primary method of quantifying severity of vulnerabilities across companies, the PCERTs, computer security response teams from nation states all over the world, etc. They pretty much, as far as the inherent severity of a vulnerability, this is the way to score it. To say how bad is it in compared to other vulnerabilities. In particular, the National Vulnerability Database from the US government, funded by the US government, the Open Source Vulnerability Database, our own CERT-CC, and other PCERT teams, etc. around the world use it routinely. Okay, with 3.1, there's been a lot of feedback over the years that really a lot of these versions, including 3.1, the scores were very variable. You give the same description of a bug to 2 or 3 different people and you get 2 or 3 different scores, which seems intuitively wrong. A group, it's in the fine print on the bottom of the page here, did a little research project and is publishing a paper with the IEEE. It isn't out yet, but there's a link to it here where you can see it. But to evaluate why it is that these things were different. Why were we getting all these differences between scoring? What was wrong with this? So their feedback in the paper is essentially, down to a couple of bullets, is the metrics for attack vector, we'll talk about these more in a minute, but user interaction and scope were not consistent. Everybody had a different idea of what those meant. And then the second one is probably the reason a lot of that happens is because the CVSS documentation is rarely consulted. 30% of scorers never have read it. So they were trying to score using a system with a bit of arcane terminology involved, and they had never looked at the specification of the user guide or the examples or anything else to figure out. So they were just sort of, you'll see if you roll over the buttons in the tool, that some pop-ups come up kind of explaining what the terms mean. And they were trying to infer and do a scoring based on pop-ups, which don't have the full story and don't help you understand what's going on. So then the other thing they found in this research study was 85% of the evaluators found that CVSS was inconsistent. 80% found it a useful tool. They thought it was a valid thing to do. And one evaluator actually said, CVSS is like democracy. It's the worst system available, except for all the other systems we've ever tried. So it's lousy, it's bad, it causes all kinds of grief and aggravation, it's inconsistent and all that, but it's the best we've found. So, sorry about that. The CVSS SIG, and Jono's involved heavily, as am I and a few others, are involved with that. And by the way, I'd like to invite folks to participate. There are some alternatives. First, CVSS itself focuses on the innate characteristics of vulnerabilities, coming up with a severity score. It's not scoring risk. Risk is an evil term because we don't know what the risk is to you. and your situation. The example that's used constantly in the SIG in discussions is you've got one vulnerability in one kind of system. In one user, that may be displaying the menu at the company cafeteria. In another system, the same vulnerable hardware and software may be controlling the cooling pumps in a nuclear power plant. It probably matters a bit differently, the risk to those systems and to the people around those systems. If the company cafeteria menu is down, oh, we'll figure it out. But if the nuclear power plant melts down, or your insulin pump goes wild, or your heart pacemaker stops, or whatever it is, it probably matters a bit more to you. So this talks about how severe is the vulnerability in not talking about the environment it's running in. And there is this thing called SSVC. Not a lot of publicity lately as much, but it's another scoring tool, but it tries to calculate, how important is this to remediate this. If I'm an IT department and I've got 900 vulnerabilities that are in my environment, a whole bunch of systems to remediate, which one do I do first? That's the goal of SSVC. I leave it to you to investigate the value of that for you and your situation. Most of us here are producers, so we're scoring things based on what we see as the vulnerability in our code. We're not the ones who are having to fix it or decide which one to fix first, so this applies to them more than us. EPSS is a fairly new one, but it's very exciting. They try and gather a bunch of information from the world at large about how vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild and how they're being used, and try and estimate how likely it is a particular vulnerability is going to be exploited in the wild. So that's a fairly new one, but it's doing some very interesting work. We'll have to see how that plays out over time. Okay, 4.0. Because of those things that we just talked about, the problems with 3.1 and earlier versions, we've made some changes that the SIG has to try and improve the situation so it's a bit more reliable. Primarily, the big thing is we had this thing we used to call scope, which was essentially, if the vulnerability is attacked, is it just that one system that's impacted? Or does that open the door for other systems around it? If this device happens to be a firewall, kind of the worst case scenario, and it's attacked and it takes down the firewall, are all the systems behind it affected or not, essentially? So that's the idea of scope. But it was really hard to interpret, and a lot of people got it wrong, and they didn't really understand what it meant, and the explanations weren't very good. And so in version 4, that's been replaced by something called the vulnerable system and the subsequent systems. And we look at we'll see the scoring vectors here on the slides here, but the VC, VI, VA, it's the old CIA of vulnerabilities, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. How are those affected on the vulnerable system, the one that's got the bug? And then are the systems around it or downstream of it or whatever, how are those things affected on systems around it? Does the vulnerability affect other systems in the network, say? Then the documentation and an online learning tool has been created to explain attack vector and user interaction scores in much more detail. Of course, if a bunch of folks, almost a third of them, never read the docs, we still got a problem there. But hopefully, publicizing this and talking about it more, we can get people to read the documentation. So, what does it look like? This is a bit of a high chart, I realize, and apologize for that. I just grabbed this out of the public documentation that's available on the web, so you can get it either off the slides or off the web, but anyway. These are all the different metrics that are part of scoring a CVSS score. The purple ones on the far left there are the base metrics. These are the ones that you as a provider, if you're reporting a vulnerability, scoring a vulnerability, these are the ones you're required to fill out. You must fill out all of these, make selections for them. Then the ones closest to me, the green ones here, these are supplementals that we provide additional value and additional interest to end users about how severe this thing is, but they don't affect the score. They're informational at this point. And I'll bring this up now because to give you an example of why they're informational. In the middle here is one called safety. Everybody says, well, how likely are people to get hurt as a result? Is it the user themselves going to die because their pacemaker quits? Or is it going to melt down a nuclear power plant and affect millions of people? And that kind of thing. Well, that kind of information is really potentially useful. If the producer knows about it or knows how their systems are likely used, and you can provide that information, that's great. But also, if you say that there is no safety impact or the safety impact is negligible, the legal department at your company are probably going to say, ooh, because the minute you say in a scoring thing, well, there's negligible impact on safety, somebody somewhere is going to get hurt and is going to sue you. So you probably don't want to be making flat statements out loud, which is, in this case, an informational thing that applies there, but you may or may not, based on your company preference, decide whether you want to say, but these are optional and informational. So they're really good information if you can provide it, but if it doesn't make sense in your situation, either you don't know or you don't want to say, but you don't want to take the liability risk, you may not want to use safety for that, for example. And the bottom one here is provider urgency. A lot of PSERT teams have their own urgency metrics about how bad is this and how that you might want to pass along to your OEM customers in our situation. And so there's sort of a traffic light protocol thing here where you can say red, green, yellow, et cetera, to indicate how bad you think it is, so you can pass that along to your OEM customers. Again, informational, doesn't affect the score. The blue section here is essentially a repeat of the base metrics in the purple section, the blue section, but this one you leave alone. The end user gets to take your information that you provided, then they take, and essentially this is a duplicate of the purple, but they do it from the perspective of my company, my situation, my involvement, and their value in here may be different than yours, the nuclear power plant versus the cafeteria menu. They may have a different viewpoint on these things. So they get an opportunity essentially to modify the score to indicate their environment. Also, we have threat here. The threat metric group is, we'll see in a minute, talks about whether this has actually been exploited in the field, whether there's a proof of concept out there and that kind of thing. This is generally used, it's sort of a time, the time is right now, does this matter? Is there a proof of concept out there? Has something been publicized about it? Do I know about active exploits? You can, as a producer, if you know that information as of the point of time that you're doing the scoring, you're welcome to add that information in here, and it will affect the score up or down, depending on what you score it. But it is point in time, obviously. At this point, when you're doing the scoring, you know, but that can change a week later, or minutes later, you could get information that's in active exploitation in the net right now. So it's just a point in the feedback of looking at the experiments around CSS version 4. Some companies, some producers have indicated that it's quite useful, and it really makes the scores better from their perspective if they use the threat metric, if they know about it. So just keep that in mind. Now, a nomenclature thing, you'll see CVSS vectors out there. Something they've been added by the SIG for this time is this, that left-hand side there, you see the example here. It says CVSS-B indicates just the base metrics are used. BE, environmental, base, and threat is BT. So if you're indicating which fields you filled out, essentially. And the score includes data from these sections of that previous slide that I showed you. It just shows you what's included in it, and just added to the nomenclature to make it really clear. So all that's required is CVSS-B, but as I just said, maybe you might want to do CVSS-BT, if that makes sense for you, where it makes the score seem more correct to you, etc. And then if the end user does the environmental and or threat or whatever, it indicates what's in the vector. Okay, I want to talk a little about that, but this is a little esoteric and you probably don't care, but I found it fascinating and very interesting how we came up with the scoring system. In CVSS 3X, etc. In order to come up with the score, you select all the options that indicate the different scoring levels, the different levels of severity, and it pops up with a numeric score. What's behind that is a mathematical formula that does a lot of floating point multiplications and that kind of thing that bumps things up, multiplied by 1.06, and bump things down, multiplied by 0.8 or something like that, drop it down. Whatever, this large mathematical formula. The CVSS SIG actually paid an accounting firm, mathematical experts, to sit down and figure out what the formula should be. Then it kind of tweaked it a little bit to make the numbers come out the way they look good. The problem is, two things happen. Most importantly, really, it's really hard to defend and explain that to anybody. If somebody questions a particular score, or I may have selected a particular value and it gave me a particular score, what does that mean? How does it, it's really hard to come up with an explanation for it. How does that work? And what does that mean? And that kind of thing. And second of all, it got so messy and so complex, it actually broke the floating point handling in JavaScript and crashed JavaScript on all the sites for a while. And they had to go fix some floating point bugs in JavaScript to get it working. So it just was not a very good way to do it. So a lot of experiment, a lot of thought went in to how do we fix that? What's a different approach? So what we did was essentially, and I won't claim much credit for this, I came in fairly late in the process, but it took all the different scores. It's a big factorial, if you get all the possible scores, there's like 15 million of them. Oh my God. No, that's just an intractable amount to deal with. But it turns out that a large number of them were essentially duplicates of each other. This one up, that one down, this one down, this one up kind of thing. And these similar and all that, they end up being pretty much the same, and the score should be the same. So it came down after a panel of experts looked at this for quite a while. They came up with 271 specific equivalency sets of scores that were equivalent to one another. So it really was only 271. Of course, between the score is 0.0 to 10.0, which is 101 scoring values. So we've got 271 sets to go in there. Plus we have to figure out what order. And I should say here, as an aside, that difference in the numbers, the distance between the numbers means nothing as far as severity level, whatever. It's strictly ordering. This one is worse than that one. And it's not how far apart they were, it means nothing about how more severe one is over the other. It's just one is more severe, one is less severe. So a 7.6 and a 7.7, or a, you know, there's one is more severe than the other one. That's all. No indication of this one is much more severe or whatever. It's none of that. So now we've got 271 equivalency sets. Experts, using a really clever tool, compared the 271 vectors just in theory, essentially, looking at the vectors without a real bug behind them, just the scores, and said, gee, this one looks, given two vectors, this one looks more severe than that one, or that one looks more severe than this one, or gee, they're about the same. And they did this randomly over the set of 271, comparing them against each other in sort of a gameplay kind of thing. And they came up, as a result of that, with an ordering of from top to bottom. 271 scored top to bottom, saying the bottom being the least severe and the top being the most severe, but taking anything else out of it. Then, once they had that rank ordering, then it turned out that when you put those on a spreadsheet, there was some sort of natural groupings that occurred in most all cases, and it turned out that we could apply that to comparing the scores with actual bugs that occurred, vulnerabilities that occurred in 3.1, we could kind of break those out into the little chart there that says, no impact is 0.0, and low, medium, high, and critical. And they just kind of naturally fell out largely into those groups. Now, obviously, there's 271 of them, and there was a batch of them that fell in each, critical and high, and there are more than 10 or 20 or whatever it is that fit in those spaces. So maintaining the order, they would compress them down to fit into those score spaces. So we compressed those all down, and then what ended up was essentially a big lookup table done in JavaScript. It's just a database of this score, this vector of answers produces this number. No math involved. It just works, And we looked at that, and it came out, and it worked pretty well. So, but then a few folks did testing and played around with it and all that, discovered that if you made, after you got a score, then you said, oh, gee, I think that I made a mistake on this one. I'm going to make this one more severe, make the selection that's more severe. But in many cases, not a lot, but in many cases, enough to matter, it turned out that when you made that change, you fell into the same equivalency set and the score stayed the same. And it felt very uncomfortable for the users to say, I made a change, I made it more severe, I made it less severe, and the score didn't change. Is this thing working? Something's wrong here. I changed it, and nothing changed. So a decision was made fairly late in the process to take a look at those cases. And any case where that kind of thing happened, just kind of arbitrarily add 0.1 or 0.2 to the score. Just indicate that, that you made it more severe, it went up 0.1. You made it less severe, it went down 0.1 or 0.2 or whatever. And it was based entirely on how much space there was between the vectors, because you didn't want to jump over one and make it more severe than the one above it kind of thing. So there's some logic in that code. Now, personally, I didn't like this. I thought it would get back to the old bad days of a formula that we couldn't really explain, but it was decided in the group that to make this saleable and usable and for people to like it, that we needed to do this. So it's in the code that's out there now. So I've been talking about all this in abstract. Let me quickly actually go to the, I'm going to go to the calculator. Okay, this is the actual calculator. In the yellow up here is the actual vector, it's called, which has the score values in it and a rather obscure and difficult to see, but that gets recorded, and then the actual numeric score. And then below this is a panel of the actual buttons. And again, I hate touchscreens, but anyway, so under the base metrics, the ones you guys are required to fill out if you're a member of your P-Cert or whatever, then you need to be able to pick one of these out. So let's try and do sort of a firmware thing. You need physical access to the machine. That's one of the requirements, so I'm selecting physical. The attack complexity. And if you hover over any of these, you get an explanation of what they are. Read the docs. Don't go by, if you just need a reminder, look at the pop-ups. But read the docs, please, because they explain these in gory detail, what they all mean. But anyway, so attack complexity is high. Attack requirements, is there anything required to be set in the configuration of the machine or whatever, like does secure boot have to be turned off? You know, that kind of thing. For example, let's say it isn't. So let's say that maybe secure boot has to be turned off. So there are attack requirements that have got to be in the initial configuration. Are any privileges required? Let's say no, because if you've got physical access, you probably don't need privileges. And user interaction is one that confuses a lot of people, and I won't rat hole on it and hold you up for your lunch on that, but user interaction is one of those. Is, do you have to get a user to do something that they normally wouldn't do? Passive means they have to do something, but it's something they would routinely do, like just opening up a spreadsheet or something like that. That's not often evil email or something, but you have to do something. Active means you have to convince them to do something they normally wouldn't do, and to cause this to happen. So we'll leave those as no privileges and no user interaction. Then now we get these vulnerable system, and loss of data confidentiality is high, data integrity is high. There can be you can brick the machine with this, so we'll say that's high as well with vulnerable system. But let's just say that the subsequent system, it only affects the firmware on this box, and it's really not going to have any effect on anybody else. So let's just say the rest of them are none of that. Note, we've got a score now. We filled out all the required ones for the base metrics, and we've got a score of 5.4. That you copy and paste the vector up there, so that everybody can see exactly what you scored each field, and you grab the number, and you're done. That's what you report in your CVE, or you talk to your OEM or whatever it is. That's what we believe that the score should be. Now the supplementals, we'll go quickly through these. I know we're right at time here for lunch. I don't want to hold you up too long, but I want to get through this. But just as I mentioned, safety, negligible safety impact, or it's present. And by the way, these terms may seem a little odd, but the SIG spends hours arguing over exact wording and what they mean and all that to make sure that we don't have cultural or language things involved, that we don't have biases and stuff. And so the wording is very careful, but you also need to read the spec to understand those terms and what they actually mean. So don't take your assumptions into this. Is it automatable? It means is it wormable? Can you create it on one system and have it propagate to another and another and another? Recovery, can you do, does recovery require user interaction like user to flash is? And we can go ahead. Nope, these are supplemental, and so they have no impact on the score. But let's say it requires the user to flash. Can you do it automatically? Is it irrecoverable? Let's say I bricked the machine, and the only choice is to send it back to the manufacturer or something like that. Value density, we'll leave that one. It's basically how much is it going to cost the end user? What's the value to them? What's the response effort from the companies? What do you believe that the response effort is involved to patch or fix this? And then, as I said, the traffic light protocol. If you use one in your PCERT to rate vulnerabilities, you can provide it here. Clear, none, green, etc. Amber, red. Just, it's a levels kind of thing to give the end user who's looking at this a heads up. And you know, whenever I select one of these, it adds the information to the vector at the top here, so that information gets provided to the end user. And they can just plug these in the calculator here. If they don't know inherently, they can just plug them in the calculator and see what they need.
And these don't affect the score?
They don't affect the score. They're just informational. Some of them may change down the road. They may move from informational into the base metrics.
Like breaking something certainly sounds like maybe on the relative score of comparing two these values, like one is it sounds medium, but a medium one that is automatic or recoverable, which is medium and risk of
Yeah, absolutely. This is great information which you probably want to provide to your end users if you possibly can. It does not affect the score currently because it's a very gradual process to make that level of changes. Then the environmental ones are essentially the same as the base scores, but they're the ones that the end user fills out. You don't mess with these usually. And the same CIAs for those and subsequent systems, etc. And environmental is the same, etc. Then down at the bottom here is the threat thing. And I said, this is a point in time, it's as of now, and the options are, it's been attacked. This vulnerability is out there, and it's being exploited in the wild. There is a proof of concept, of POCs, there's a proof of concept out there, but you don't know of anybody who's actively attacking systems in the field. And last, it's unreported, I don't know, or there aren't any that we know of. So feel free, if that does affect the score, let's see. Let's just, proof of concept. It's only a proof of concept, so that drops the score. Unreported, there's no attacks out there, it drops it way down. But attacked, on the other hand, it goes up a bit. And not defined stays the same. So it really doesn't go up. It just, but if you know that there's only a proof of concept and you're not aware of any actual attacks in the field, you can drop your score down, make yourself look much better. There have been no reported attacks, drop it way down.
Trust unreported? I mean, unreported could sound like you don't know. If you don't know,
But it really, what it comes down to is not defined means I have no idea. Unreported means that I've looked around, done scans of the net and that kind of thing, then reached out to the providers and that kind of thing, who gather information about vulnerabilities being attacked, and I'm providing that. Again, read the docs. I'm glossing over a lot of stuff here. There are hundreds, if not thousands of hours of discussion has gone into each one of these fields. So, okay, so I don't tie you up from lunch too long here. Let's go ahead and switch back. Extend. Okay, there's a link page here. You can go to first.org, CVSS SIG in the left-hand panel, and then the 4.0 page, and you can, the 3.1 stuff is there as well, but you can get all of these links on there. And learning.first.org, there's actually an online training session the last couple hours, I think, that it fills you in on how this scoring works and all that. So that's there for information. Okay, here are the calls for action. Just 3 slides really quickly, but we'll talk about what I'd like you to think about and do here as a group. Scoring is not simple. It's tricky, and most of the examples, the people who do this are, as they refer to, the chairs of the group are from companies like Cisco that do packet pushers, they call themselves. And a lot of the stuff is from software and from network providers and firewall people and some OS people and that kind of thing. Firmware is not well represented here. It wasn't represented at all. Bruce from the Intel PCERT actually asked us to get engaged a couple of years ago, and that's how I got involved with this. Bruce Mitchell asked the group that they were updating the some of the documentation, and they wanted to get some more information about firmware in there. So Phoenix was good enough, Jim's help. We found 3 good examples, known CVEs that are here, that we added to the 3.1 documentation. And then when we updated that recently to the 4.0 documentation and removed scope and changed all of that, and we updated those to about how you would score those 3 firmware problems as examples. My call to action for you folks is, if you know about other good examples, particularly ones that are hard to score, where you're not really sure whether it's whether the user needs privileges or not, or whatever, or how's that going to impact? Create an example, provide it, come to the SIG yourself and provide it, or send it through me or whatever, we'll get it out there. It's really helpful to see good examples with explanations for why did you choose each field. It really helps other people who are going to be doing this. So provide good examples. As Jono said earlier, and others, if you handle more than 1 or 2 vulnerabilities a year, you should be a CNA, excuse me, easy for me to say, a CVE numbering authority. The idea here is, by the way, I checked. I did a roster check between all the CNAs in the world and membership of the UEFI forum, promoters and contributors, and it's roughly 50%. 50% of the UEFI promoters and contributors are already CNAs, but there's a good 50% that are not. And really, if you're handling, and as Tim was saying earlier, has hundreds of vulnerabilities going through the office, whether they're real or not, and how many of them actually get reported, and I think most of you, your PCERT training teams, assuming you have one, or just whoever's stuck doing that work in your organization, you're knowing about a lot of vulnerabilities and probably that should be reported. And you end up having to go to the CNA of last resort at MITRE or something like that. So you should be doing this yourself. You can get your own numbers on demand. You don't have to ask somebody else for a number. You control the content of what's in that report. You fill it in yourself. So you don't get somebody else trying to guess or infer stuff from you that is not true. You control explicitly when it goes public. So if you have your own embargo, you can tell your OEM customer, here's a problem with vulnerability that we're working on, here's a fix, here's the CVE number when it gets published, so you can reference it in your docs and all that. You have the number assigned, but you don't flip the public then. And so nobody knows about it except you and people you tell about it. But you control that entirely. You don't have accidents where some administrator at MITRE or the NVD or whatever it is accidentally flips the button and goes public with something you didn't want to have public yet. So anyway, the open source Tiana core is a CNA itself. So anything that's in the Tiana core code base that's a vulnerability should be reported by the InfoSec team at Tiana core, and they should be getting CVEs for that code. But anything you produce that's part of your product, you should be a CNA and creating your own CVEs for those. And that requires you to do the scoring thing that I just talked about. That's one of the reasons I'm talking about it here. Then, lastly, this is just a general challenge. I don't know how we're going to do this. I don't have any recommendations. But as I said, there's a lot of variability in scoring, and it's embarrassing when two companies essentially end up scoring the same vulnerability and come up with significantly different answers. And it would really be nice if we had some guidelines and consistency around firmware vulnerabilities and how they're scored and what does it mean, and these fields that are a little fuzzy or a little hard to understand. If we kind of agree among ourselves on how we're going to answer those questions, it would help with the consistency and not embarrass somebody by having an arbitrarily low score because they made a mistake or whatever. So I'm throwing this out there as a challenge, and I'd be happy to hear from you and champion something if we can. But is there a way we can sort of work together to be more consistent about our scoring? So that was my last call to action, and we're not going to discuss your questions because I'm holding you up from lunch. So anyway, thank you very much, and I hope this was helpful for those who have not been exposed to this at all before. And for those who are, now you know a little about 4.0 that's coming out in just a few weeks, and you can take that home and explain it to your research team. So if there's any urgent questions, I'll be right here. I'd be happy to take them. But anyway, I don't want to hold folks up too much. So I'll see you back here at 1 o'clock for the rest of the presentations, and we will take afternoon break today. So you will get a chance to get